Hello everybody, this is going to be a video that is addressing the recent incidents, the recent controversy on the Wi Spa trans patron at the Korean spa in Los Angeles. I think this happened about a week ago. Video uploaded on, I want to say Instagram or Tumblr, not sure which one, and then now protests everywhere. And I don't want to talk about the protests and the specifics of this case so much as just kind of the idea of this is really showing the importance of the freedom of association and how its abolition causes there to be needless strife. So, personally, I've actually been to Korean spas before. I have been to co-ed showers with men and women. I just ran one a few weeks ago at the Porcupine Freedom Festival, and I have actually communally showered with trans people on at least 3 occasions that I know about, maybe more. So, not to say that my personal anecdotal experience defines everything. It's certainly not going to be the basis of my ideology here, just to say that I have some experience with this. It's not the first time that I've ever encountered it. So the problem we have here is that it's absolutely ridiculous and asinine to think that there should be a national or state law mandating who can associate with who. Whether this is in your private life, and I think most people tend to understand that. Like, no one should say that you should be forced to date somebody else, whether that person is another race or another sex, or if they're trans or non-binary or whatever the case may be. It's your life, and you can decide who you want to associate with when you have friends, when you have dates. Where people have the problem, at least selectively, and we'll get into the irony of how many people on the left view this, should also apply to your public life. You want to own a business. Owning a business does not obligate you to help somebody. If I put in the time and effort to accumulate the capital and to run a business, whatever it is, whether I sell cakes or pizzas or run a gym, that does not then obligate me to everyone in the world, right? That just obligates me to do nothing, actually. I haven't incurred any obligations other than to my creditors or to my employees that I have contracts with, or specific customers who I have contracts with. If I don't, then I don't owe them anything. Now, the vast majority of businesses are going to try and accommodate as many people as possible, right, for good reason, for profitability's sake. And there is this interesting dichotomy that many of the opponents of capitalism have, where they think on the one hand it's rapaciously greedy, rapaciously evil, driven only by profit, but then on the other hand will actively, openly, and overwhelmingly discriminate as much as possible. And the two of these are basically mutually exclusive. You might find small side cases, minimal, marginal cases where sometimes discriminating is profitable, but it's pretty rare. And discrimination based on something that's immutable is very rare. Now, there might be some discrimination. I was listening to a person who runs a gym saying that power lifters in his gym are bad for business because not only do they chase people away because they're intimidating, and they make up less than less than 1,000th of the population, they also are much more likely to break the equipment. And so he would just rather assume that there were no power lifters in his gym because they drive away most of the business and they are more costly. They use the gym a lot more. They're more likely to break things. I don't think, though, most people, and if this guy, and I believe he didn't actually prevent them from using his gym, but if he were, I do wonder if people would seriously question that and be like, no, you shouldn't be able to discriminate against a power lifter. In terms of discriminating against immutable characteristics, and of course debatable to say that a trans person has immutable characteristics, that's going to be very, very rare. That's almost always going to fall outside the purview of profitability, right? It's just say we don't want women, or we don't want black people, or we don't want Jews. That's not going to be a winning strategy in the overwhelming majority of the businesses, the overwhelming majority of the time. Marginal exceptions may exist, but they will not dominate society, and they will not be systemic by any measure. There is a great myth here. People believe this is what was happening up until the Civil Rights Act, and that there was this mass conspiracy of private businesses around the country to discriminate against black people in particular, and this is completely wrong. Jim Crow was very much a creature of municipal and state, and in many cases federal regulations that mandated that there be separation of the races, right? So you can criticize that as much as you want and talk about the evils of Jim Crow and Plessy versus Ferguson and double standards and blah, blah, blah. You can't assume that that happened because of the free market. And the evidence that we have shows that it was quite contrary to market forces, which seem to push towards at least economic integration of a customer base. So you have this situation where, I think that there's obviously good arguments for both sides. I think there's plenty of people in the world who, in the United States, in California, anywhere, who, if they were in a spa environment, would not mind at all if they were seeing a trans person or indeed just a cis person of the opposite sex. Like I said, there are people who don't mind being in co-ed naked situations. On the other hand, you have people who don't like being in naked situations, whether or not they're trans, cis, or any other type of person. Right? There's a large fraction of the population, I'd say disturbingly large, that just is completely anathema to any kind of nudity whatsoever, regardless of the sexual or gender status of other people, right? They want to have privacy, period. Among the people who are more open with some public nudity, I think that they're going to vary, and some of them are going to say they're okay with it, and some of them are going to say that they're not, and sometimes they might have good reasons, and sometimes they may not. They don't really need a good reason, though, for their comfort level. And the other thing is it should be up to the businesses and the people who use them. And if you are somebody who doesn't agree with that, if you think, well, a trans person has every bit as much right. Yeah, but they have rights too as other customers. And there's this kind of trumping of certain classes and saying, well, even if you have a preference that your 8-year-old daughter not see a penis and a beard on a person who identifies as a woman, and of course the definition of trans that is now acceptable is one who just identifies as a woman. They don't even have to have had any surgery or any hormonal treatments whatsoever. They can just be a cis man biologically in every way and then just say that they are a woman. And it is entirely conceivable to have somebody say, I'd rather not have to deal with that. I want a safe space, right? There's a legitimate, and there's kind of cross purposes here where we have this other movement, this Me Too movement, this glorification of the victimization of women, and this greater, and in many cases, this kind of devolves into a witch hunt where you have people who are not really guilty of any serious crime or serious rights violation, but nonetheless, because of their what is perceived as boorish behavior, are dismissed as the most evil person imaginable. That's going quite contrary to now this, because you have, that's exaggerated in a lot of ways, but it also raises some legitimate points, right? Many women feel threatened by men, at least in some circumstances, and not completely without justification, right? Men are certainly capable of raping women. It's exaggerated how often that happens, but it does. Men typically are physically much larger and stronger than women. They're more aggressive. Again, there's bell curves to this, and you can find some overlap on those curves for sure, but that is definitely the case. Even when somebody is trans and they have gone through surgery and they've gone into hormones, this does not usually on average make up the difference, right? A man who transitions to a woman is probably not going to become the same strength as the average cis woman. They're probably still going to be significantly stronger. There's going to be differences in their bone structure, their bone density, their size, the size of their body parts, their shoulders, their arms, their latent muscle tone and mass, and fat and lean mass distribution. And so they're not the same thing. And it's not ridiculous for some people to say, maybe I don't want to have to deal with that. Maybe I'm concerned about that. Maybe that's not what I want to see when I go here. And I'll be honest too, as a gay man, I don't particularly like seeing naked women. I put up with it when I ran a shower that had to be co-ed, and it wasn't a bad thing. We didn't have any problems. This also will go into another kind of related issue where you've had a lot of gay bars, like predominantly, bars that are catered to and frequented by gay men, who in some situations start to get frequented by straight women. I don't know if they just feel safer there or they just think it's fun. And so there's a very famous gay resort town on the tip of Cape Cod called Provincetown. I've only visited it once, so I'm not exactly like the most familiar with it, but one of the best ways to get there is to take a ferry from Boston, and there has become like a trend, very common trend of bachelorette parties So large numbers of straight females taking ferries over to Provincetown and then entering the bars to party. Well, the gay men who go there don't want to see that typically. I mean, many gay men do have straight friends, they have female friends, have cis friends. Many gay men have a lot of feminine qualities, but that does not mean that they all want to see straight girls. Now, I'm sure some of them don't mind, and some of them even maybe think it's great, but many, many of them don't. And it was kind of interesting to see the soul searching that happened in some of the articles here, because what you basically had going on was very left-wing, pro-civil rights, anti-freedom of association, left-wing homosexuals coming to grips with the fact that they wanted to discriminate and exclude somebody, not because they were a Nazi, not because they were evil, not because they were a criminal, not because they were a felon, but because they were a woman, something that these women, whatever their flaws, have absolutely no control over. It's not something they decided to do. It's not something they elected to do. They just are female. They were born that way. They're cis females, I assume, in the overwhelming majority of cases. And yet these gay men find themselves wishing that they could not be allowed. And you had cases where bouncers were basically telling these girls to go. It's clearly discrimination, though. It's clearly discrimination, though. And I would say a very similar principle applies here. The idea that there is going to be a single policy for restrooms, for locker rooms, for showers, for the whole country is just silly. You have to have a very simplistic mind where you externalize and generalize your personal preferences to everybody and think, well, I don't have a problem with it, or even if you do, that you think it is somehow valuable in some objective sense that supersedes any qualms or qualifications or worries that might exist, and just say, well, anyone who doesn't want this, they are therefore a bigot, and therefore they can be dismissed. It's also interesting, too, as I alluded to, that these freedom of association, the idea is that the freedom of association is dead if you have a business that incurs an obligation to serve whoever you want, which is a weird kind of pseudo type of slavery where you're obligated to serve somebody. You're obligated to, say, bake somebody a cake or a pizza or whatever other good or service it is that you ostensibly are offering. You're not offering now. You're being told that you have to do it. But then if you are a huge conglomerated subsidized social media platform, then you can actually discriminate against anyone whose ideology you don't like, and they can use vague unsupported accusations that you violated policies that can't be defined and that they can't even point to, and punish, exclude, deny service to millions of people, and they do. And it was very interesting, and I've made videos to this effect, to see all of these left-wing liberals, these very anti-freedom of association, pro-Civil Rights Act people suddenly saying that, well, it's a private company, it can do what it wants. Well, here, it's a private company and it should be able to do whatever it wants, and the customers should be able to do whatever they want. And this type of discrimination is not going to be very common. You're going to have places that are perfectly happy to have trans people in them, whatever their status, whether they're post-op, pre-op, cis, non-binary, whatever. And you're going to have other places that are less welcoming for any number of reasons. They could be practical reasons. There could be, so you see this in something like a sport, right? It's not just about their sensibilities. We know that male to female athletes have tremendous advantages to the point that exceeds even, taking steroids for a regular cis female, and that they will then completely dominate these sports. Completely. It will mean, as Caitlyn Jenner said, it will mean the end of women's sports. Now, I can totally see a particular league saying, well, we value, the inclusion of these women, these trans women, more than we value having there be a fair competition. And so if it means that no cis woman will ever win ever again, so be it. We are in favor of that. And I can imagine that there will be athletic leagues, if they're privately operated and not beholden to the regulations, the regulatory fiat of the state, that would do that. I could just as easily see other private associations of athletes and athletic leagues saying, we don't want that. Right, just like you can see athletic leagues that say steroids are fine and we allow them in, and it's like just taking a wink, nod, and other ones that are much more adamant that they not be used, right? I don't think that the idea that, well, we should have a zero steroid policy for everybody in the country, including, right, people who need it for medical reasons, and then we should have, or a mandated steroid policy for everybody else, just like we shouldn't have a mandated trans person or not trans person. It's also very interesting that we're going to take such a tiny, tiny group and then say policy for everybody needs to be completely dictated by this. That doesn't make any sense. The market reaction to really tiny groups should be localized and specific and not generalized to everybody. There's also a lot of these people being used as political weapons, whether they want to or not. Now, I'm sure that there are politically activist trans people, just like there are politically activist white people and black people and feminists and gay people who are fully happy to weaponize their identity and use it as a bludgeon to get what they want. That certainly happens. On the other hand, there's plenty of people who fall into these categories who are not interested in doing that. They don't want to be used as a weapon. They don't want to be used as a rallying cry or a slogan or as an excuse to do anything. And to come to another area that I have a lot of experience in, the communal showers debate. Like I said, I've taken communal showers with, at this point, at least 3 trans people. I've talked to all of them about it, and none of them said that they, for instance, were against using communal showers. None of them said that they wanted stalls. None of them said that they would prefer using stalls. And actually, I've never, in point of fact, ever heard a trans person say that they would rather use a stall than a communal shower. However, in just about any and every debate, and I've now gone and looked at the records of a lot of school districts about the efficacy of communal showers versus stalls, it is almost always taken for granted that trans people want stalls and that we should build stalls to protect trans people. Now, this is never a trans person saying this. This is always a cisgendered administrative person or a concerned liberal parent or something like that. And nobody wants to say, I'm afraid of nudity and it scares me and I'm not comfortable being naked, so I'm going to say that the reason we need to have stalls is to help protect trans people. I'm not a trans person and I don't have any evidence of this. When I talked to an academic who did a study on this, he said he could find no evidence that trans people don't like communal showers or that they prefer stalls, and yet they will be used as a weapon with or without their knowledge or consent nonetheless. And I think this is an example of that happening again. Not the same topic. Obviously, this isn't a debate about communal showers, although it's not that far off, right? And I would say, as an advocate of somebody, and I'm speaking now as an advocate of someone who enjoys communal showers and think that they have a lot of personal benefits, I also don't believe that they should be mandated. I don't think that we should scoop people up and tell them that they all have to communal shower together. I don't believe in, when I ran my co-ed shower, I would not have forced anybody to use it. I would not have forced any man to use it, any woman to use it, any teen to use it. I would not have forced any trans person to use it or not to use it. And these spas are the same thing. No one is forced to use them. If they want to use them, it's on their negotiated preference. And I could definitely see, it's funny too, like where they draw these lines. Planet Fitness, interestingly enough, a few years ago announced that they would allow trans people to use, basically you can use any locker room that you want. This is actually something a lot of gyms have said. I have friends who work at a very large recreational facility in Wyoming. He said the rule is anybody can use any locker room, right? If you're as a cis man and you want to go in the women's room, you can. All right? I mean, it's so because they allow trans people to use either one, and because the definition of what is trans is so incredibly open-ended, then there is just no point in trying to enforce it, because anybody could just go in and say, I'm trans. They don't have to produce any paperwork. They don't have to produce any medical reports on their pheromone or hormone count or any surgical alterations. They can just say, I identify as trans, and boom, that's it. So it just becomes the only policy that they can really even enforce is anybody can use it at any time. And I can definitely see a place saying that we don't want that, right? And, maybe it's at a place with lots of children. Maybe it's a place with lots of women who just want to relax that way, or men, right? I mean, this is from the case of women who maybe are worried about getting raped or being physically assaulted, but I could just as easily see men saying, look, we want to have time for the guys. We want to have a place for men. We want to have a place where we can socialize, and we don't want a woman in here. We don't want a woman. We don't want a cis person. And maybe you think that they're a bigot. Maybe you don't like that rationale. That's fine. You can definitely think that, and you can protest, and you can boycott, and you can say that it's wrong. You can try and persuade, but what you can't do is come and arrest them and throw them in prison. What you can't do is come and put fines on them and say you have to do this because the government said so, because we got a majority of people in one House of Congress in one particular year, people who are elected by a corrupted system based on money and special interests and rhetoric and failure to live up to any campaign promises with no accountability whatsoever. And we got them to pass a 10,000-page bill that included in there something that says that you can't do that. And if you do, we're going to punish you in the most draconian way possible, right? We're going to throw you in prison, charge you, and then we're going to have the sanctimony to act like we're better than you in every possible way, that you're evil, that you're terrible, that you're a horrible person for even so much as questioning the morality of the system, and the system is obviously corrupt. And I think people totally, in other contexts, understand that. Well, we can look at all the things. Think of all the laws that were passed. I don't care who I'm speaking to, if you're a liberal, conservative, libertarian, whatever. You can think of laws that existed, that were passed, that were law, that had the force of law, that you think were clearly wrong, and even probably in many cases clearly evil. Not just wrong, but evil. And even if you think a given law is right, you have to then realize there's a chance that you're wrong, and you shouldn't be forcing people to do stuff that might not be right, right? There's some ambiguity, some doubt. So the other thing is that because this stuff now becomes policy and because something that the government is controlling, then it becomes something we have to fight for, right? Then it becomes something, a battlefield in the culture war. And so instead of saying, okay, you do you, I'll do me, and never the twain shall meet, and we'll cooperate. Maybe we'll go shopping at the same, supermarket together. We might not go to the same gym. That seems like a perfectly reasonable thing to do. Nope, now we have to have a battle about it. And it's going to have to be all the forces of the people who don't want this to happen or think that the principle of it happening is bad versus all the people who do. And we can just get in a huge argument and fight over this, even though there's a million problems that are much harder and that can't be solved by us just associating however we want, but we can't work on those because we have to now argue about this again and again and again. And I remember having this debate even when I was in college. There was some local municipal ordinance about anti-discrimination, basically meaning you can't fire somebody for being gay. I even at the time, even as a gay person, I thought that was ridiculous. You should be able to be fired for any reason. Not that most employers are going to do that. It's kind of like a measure to make you feel good. If anything, it will make it harder to hire gay people, because why would you hire somebody that there's a risk if you fire them for any reason, they can just come back and say, well, the reason you fired me is because I'm gay and now I'm suing you. No one wants to have to deal with that. So how about we just never hire you in the first place? Boom. But this idea that, people at first, this is changing too. I mean, it won't be long before we've retreated all the way to this point. But it's like, look, if it's your personal life, say you own a house and you got a spare room and you want to rent it out, you should be able to pick who rents it out. If there's somebody who you don't like for whatever reason, doesn't matter if it's a bigoted reason, a good reason, a personal reason, a political reason, you should be able to say, no, it's your house. And at the time, the people I was debating with said, yeah, well, they agreed with that. But if you got to a certain level, and I think the level in the state was something like if you had 5 rooms or 6 rooms, then suddenly it stopped being your personal property in the sense that you couldn't control who lived there. It became something that the state could regulate to its heart's desire. And I think that was a completely arbitrary line. And of course, it gets pushed farther and farther, maybe not by those same people, but by the people who were raised up in their shadow, right? So if you come up with the idea that that's possible, then the next thing is, why do we allow it for people with 7 apartments? Maybe we should only allow it for people with 1, and then with none, and then next thing you know, you're a criminal if you refuse to date somebody because you're not interested in them for whatever reason. And actually, the argument for that is pretty strong, because people are more emotionally invested in the people they want to date. Like, it's one thing if you go to a store or you go to a spa and they say, we don't want you in the spa. I mean, I had this. It's funny. Like, the time I did go to a Korean spa, I went with 2 friends, both gay, both guys that I'd known for quite a while. This Korean spa was in New York City. Wasn't cruisy. You weren't allowed to hook up. There was none of that going on. And we went to the part that was co-ed, where it wasn't naked. You wore like loincloths, and there were saunas, and there was a bar, and it was nice. And then we went to the wet area, and the wet area had a mandated nudity policy. You had to go in naked. And one of my friends refused at first. He said, "I'm not going to do it, and you can't make me get naked." And they said, "No, we can't make you get naked, but we don't have to let you in either." And he said, "Well, I paid," and he was a law student. He's now a lawyer, but he was a law student at the time. So I was saying, "You can't force me." Like, no, but we're not going to let you in if you're not naked. You have to be naked. And he was obviously like very did not want to get naked. I don't know why. He was in great shape, but he was very nervous about getting naked, even though the two of us had both seen him naked already. So I don't know why it was such a big step for him, but it was. And it was clearly something he was emotionally very, very opposed to. He really, really wanted to avoid it at all costs, and they refused to let him in. So me and the other guy went in on our own, and sure enough, 5 minutes later, rather than be alone, he walked in naked and everything was fine. But the point here is that his adamancy about not going was heartfelt and emotional, right? He couldn't really articulate a reason. He doesn't really need a reason, though. His lived experience is that he was terrified to get naked. And so this could just as easily have been a debate about that, a viral video of him arguing with them about that. And people could say, why are they forcing him to get naked? Because it's their spa, and that's the rule. And this is going to, I think, be pushed eventually to the point where if you refuse to date, sex, hook up, befriend somebody, become a gym buddy, whatever, people are going to say that's a crime. You're being racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, whatever the case may be. There's a long list of sufficiently vague phobias that they can slander you with that lack really sound definitions. None of these things have really explicit definitions, and they can just go and then accuse you of the worst, most heinous type of crime, right, for exercising freedom of association. If you're a murderer, there's some, and I think even I've heard Sam Harris talk about this. If there's a murderer, there's a path back to social graces. But if you're anti-woke, right, if you exercise your freedom of association, which means you're not coercing anybody, you're just refusing to associate with certain people under certain circumstances, that's the worst thing you could possibly do. And it's just a marker, an indicator of the totalitarianism of this ideology. It's absolutely totalitarian. They don't like the way that you think. They don't like the way that you act. And they will protest and legislate and coerce to try and go the other way. And that is a system that will lead to violence, right? If you can't just separate and associate how we freely like, then that will lead to coercion and resistance and to violence. And nothing that you're fighting for is worth that. I mean, there are maybe things that are worth that. There might be things, if you're going to fight to save the world from, a horrible disease or a horrible enemy, right? Like we're getting invaded by the Chinese communists. Like, okay, fine. Debatable even then, but like, okay, I can kind of see it. But for this, no, it's just completely ridiculous, completely asinine. So those are my thoughts. And also, I think I'll put a link. I came out with a new podcast episode. I'll put a link to that in the description so you all can check that out if you'd like. And I will talk to you all later. Goodbye.